Hello everyone, welcome to Diagnostics by Rick. Today is episode 4 on oscilloscopes, and it is the second part of a two-part series in getting a usable waveform on the screen. If you've not seen episode 3 yet, stop here, go watch it first, and then come back to this one. I'll link that video in the description below. In the last video, we discussed setting up the voltage scale and the sweep time on the scope. Today, we will be covering trigger and slope, the last two things you need to get a usable waveform on the screen. But before we get into that, I want to discuss aliasing, because it has to do with the sweep setting, and it could lead to a technician believing something is wrong with the signal, when in reality they really just have an aliasing scope. Aliasing can cause a misdiagnosis if the technician is not aware it can happen and does not know what to look for. If the sample rate frequency is less than the signal frequency, then you will not get a proper reconstruction of the signal you are testing. For example, if this sine wave is what we are trying to see, but we only see these sample points, then we will see a flat line on our screen. Of course, it would be difficult to get a sample rate that perfectly matched the peaks of this sine wave to get a perfectly flat line. So it would be unlikely to see it just like that, but what you would likely get is a signal that doesn't match the frequency of what the actual signal is. Let's take a look at the same sine wave and assume we take these sample points. The scope will draw a sine wave, but the frequency of the signal is not correct, and neither is the amplitude. Now imagine that the sample rate is close to the frequency of the signal being tested, but not quite there. This could result in an occasional missed pulse. So you could be testing, say, a crank sensor and see a missing tooth, when in reality there's nothing wrong at all. It's just the sample rate is too low to pick up every tooth. Here's an example. If the sample points taken were at these locations, then this is what the scope would draw. So you can see how this can lead you to an incorrect conclusion that something is wrong with the crank sensor, or maybe there's a broken tooth off the reluctor. This is just a short section and it shows 2 missing pulses. Maybe that's a broken reluctor wheel, or maybe you've got your sample rate set too low, or possibly too much time on the screen. One more thing. Don't forget that the display of your tool, be it a laptop or a standalone unit, it has limits to how many pixels it can display. So even if the scope is not aliasing, the displayed waveform cannot exceed the resolution of the screen. This is more of an issue with Snap-on because you can't choose to simply zoom in a little more and get more detail on a waveform that you've already captured. So even if the sample points aren't aliased on the screen, you may not be able to see it correctly, or the scope may not be able to draw it correctly due to a limited number of pixels. With a Pico style, even if the image isn't drawn correctly due to the pixel limits of your laptop, you can just zoom in a little more and overcome that issue. High-speed signals are much more likely to alias. This is from a fuel pump control module on a Ford car. It was a no start with no fuel pump operation, and I needed to verify the control and feedback signal to the control module and the PCM were good. This is the first capture that I took, and so far everything looks good. But what if I told you that this capture is completely wrong and does not represent what is actually happening? I decided to zoom in a little more to make the squares a little larger, so I changed the sweep time to 20 milliseconds from 50 milliseconds. If you count right now, there are 21 squares on the yellow trace. So naturally, if I change the sweep from 50 down to 20, we should get about 40% as many squares, which should be about 8.4 squares. So imagine my surprise when instead I see this. So many squares so tightly packed that I don't even want to try to count them. The signal was aliasing and I didn't even realize it because it looked so perfect. It turns out that Ford uses a high-frequency signal for communication to its fuel pump control module. Here is that same signal at multiple sweep times. I highlighted all the sweeps red. Starting in the top left corner, we are at just 1 millisecond of sweep, and that is for the entire screen, not per division. So in 1 millisecond, there are about 10 squares. If we double the sweep to 2 milliseconds, then we double the number of yellow squares. You can see about 20. I didn't count them, but at 5 milliseconds, there should be about 2.5 times again, so somewhere around 50. Double again to 100 for 10 milliseconds, and again to 200 for 20 milliseconds. Here we reach just about the resolution limitations of the screen. If we slow the scope down any more, we wouldn't even be able to pick out lines between the squares and should instead see a solid block of yellow with no gaps. But that's not what happens. At 50 milliseconds, suddenly it drops back down to about 20 squares. Did the signal suddenly change frequency? No, it's just aliasing and showing us the wrong frequency. In a later episode, we will discuss filtering, peak detect, glitch capture, and resolution enhancement. Some scopes have built-in filtering, which makes them more likely to alias than others. Using some of these features can help aliasing, while others can make it worse. This capture is from a crank sensor on a Chrysler. There's nothing wrong with this vehicle. It looks like one of the pulses from the crank sensor is missing. It should be a repeating pattern of 4 pulses, yet one of them only has 3. The issue here is that the pulse width of the signal is very small. If you have too much time on the screen, then the sample rate as compared to the width of the pulse is so low that the scope may miss it. So whether or not the capture is aliasing or just exceeding the screen, what the screen can display is really irrelevant. Either way, you could misdiagnose this vehicle if you use this capture with these settings. There should be 4 squares in every block. Here's what the pattern would look like zoomed in. This is a block of 4 pulses from the crank sensor. Now imagine that we have sample points here. If you notice, the sample points are far enough apart that we generally only get 1 sample point at the top of each pulse, and the last pulse, the sample points fell in such a way that we didn't get any at the top. If the scope were to draw this, it would give you something similar to what we saw in the snap-on capture. Now I want to stop for a moment and say this. DSOs do not necessarily put a point exactly where every sample point is taken and then connect the dots. Instead, they use algorithms with interpolation, and they do their best to try to recreate what is actually happening. There are different types of interpolation, some more complex than others, but each has its strength and weakness for accuracy. These are just pieces of the calculations used in interpolation. If you like higher level statistical math, then research it more yourself, but it's not really necessary to understand exactly how it works to understand that the scope uses it. All you need to know is that there is some averaging and predictions happening when the oscilloscope decides how to draw that line on your screen. More data points will mean a more accurate model, at least to a point. So with the capture on the snap-on, it is very possible that there were multiple sample points taken at the top of each square and every single pulse, including the missing pulse. So why then did it not draw it? Well, because the formulas they use are trying to account for anomalies and noise that is inherent to all electrical circuits, and maybe just some EMI from the surrounding area. So the scope may have seen the pulse, but decided it wasn't worth drawing it for whatever reason in their calculations. Maybe the sample interval was just too short, it thought maybe it was interference, or maybe just whatever, however they're averaging it, they decided not to draw it. It's also possible that it didn't take the sample point. Here are 2 more captures from the same vehicle. The left capture at 200 milliseconds. The scope sometimes only displays 3 or maybe even 3.5. The half pulses are due to the previously mentioned math, trying to approximate as close as it can to what is really happening. Unfortunately, there's too few sample points on this capture for those calculations to be accurate. If we go up to 500 milliseconds on the screen, most of the blocks of 4 squares is represented by only 1 square. There's a couple of 4 square packets represented by 2 pulses and a couple more represented by 3, but most of them have a single square wave that are representing the packet of 4 squares. We know this is not correct, and if we put up a more appropriate sweep of 100 milliseconds, we can see that it is indeed 4 pulses in every block of squares. At idle, 100 milliseconds is the maximum sweep time we should use. And if you plan to rev the engine off idle, you should probably use an even faster sweep time, because as the engine revs, even less time will pass between pulses. Again, I'll be covering filters, peak detect, glitch capture later, all of which will affect this issue. My rule of thumb is, when in doubt, increase the sample rate if you can, or just decrease the amount of sweep time if your signal seems to be missing something or is not quite what you expected. If the signal looks different after you change the sweep or sample rate, then you didn't have your scope set up correctly. I mean, obviously it will be more zoomed in if you put less time on the screen, but I mean if the pattern changes. The shape of the signal should always be the same regardless of the sweep time set. If you have a missing tooth at 50 milliseconds of sweep, that tooth should also be missing at 5 milliseconds if aliasing is not what's causing it. Now what about the Pico? Well, excluding communication signals, it is usually a bit more difficult to get the Pico to alias. Don't get me wrong, it can be done if you select grossly incorrect settings, but generally it won't do it. Back to that rule of thumb, typically setting a sample rate of 1 million samples times the number of channels you have turned on for every second of sweep you have on the screen. That may not be enough for flex rate, but it should handle most signals you'll be looking at when diagnosing a vehicle. Now let's move on to trigger and slope. The terms trigger and slope are two terms that a lot of Pico users don't even have in their vocabulary. It's rare that I actually use trigger with my Pico. But I actually do want Pico users to practice using and learn how to use this one, because someday you may find yourself needing to use a different type of scope. Snap-on, however, it is set up more like a live scope, making trigger and slope very important. So what is trigger? No, not that kind of trigger. Or that one. DSO is always measuring, always recording. But it may not be saving that recorded information if you have not told it you want to keep it. In fact, it may not even be displaying it on the screen, unless you told it to. Let's look at a zoomed out waveform of some fuel injection. If you notice, there's a lot more dead space with nothing happening than there is active space. If you were to look at this in real time, you would mostly see nothing but a flat line. And then a fuel injector pattern would whoosh by, and then it would be gone again in an instant. The whole thing might only last a few milliseconds. Even if your eyes are fast enough to see it go by, it certainly wasn't there long enough to pick out any detail, and then you're right back to dead space. Let me show you an example of what I mean. I'm going to connect my test vehicle here, and then let's see if we can pick out any details of the fuel injector. Not only does it come and go in a flash, the next time the injector fires, it's not even in the same place on the screen. It's bouncing all over the place, and it's hard to make heads or tails out of it. This is because right now the scope is just drawing what it sees as it sees it. Instead, what we want to do is tell the scope to hold. Don't draw anything on the screen until a certain criteria are met. When that happens, begin drawing until you've filled up the entire screen, then stop. Don't draw again until the criteria has been met again. That criteria is our trigger point. So now with the trigger set, the pattern is much easier to see since it's always in the same place and it doesn't fly by so fast we miss the detail. Since scopes work with voltage, our trigger point is typically set as a voltage level. If we set the trigger to 4 volts, then whenever the signal crosses the 4-volt threshold, the scope will start drawing until the screen is full. Then it will stop and not draw again unless the signal once again crosses the 4-volt threshold. Slope tells the scope which direction the signal needs to cross the trigger point before it starts to draw. We can have a rising or a positive slope, or we can have a falling or negative slope. And they're pretty self-explanatory. If we set the trigger to 4 volts, and we set a rising slope, then we're telling the scope to start drawing whenever the signal voltage moves from below 4 volts to above 4 volts. It won't care if the voltage goes the other way. So if the voltage goes from 10 to 2, it won't draw. But if it moves from 2 to 10, it will draw, because we are setting a rising slope or an upslope. Now change the slope to a falling slope or a negative slope, and the oscilloscope won't begin drawing until it sees the signal voltage move from anywhere above 4 volts to anywhere below 4 volts. Okay, before I start playing this capture, let's look at what we have. The little plus sign here is our trigger point. I would guess it is somewhere around 6 or 7 volts maybe. It doesn't matter exactly where it is on this particular capture, although in some diagnostic situations you might want to set a very precise trigger point for a specific reason. But in this case, we just want to see a fuel injection pattern. We know that there should be battery voltage on the control side. Then the PCM will ground that injector by pulling it low. Then it will release the ground, causing a temporary spike before getting back to battery voltage. Slope is right here. You can see I have it set to a rising slope or a positive slope. It moves in the upward direction up and to the right. Assuming the trigger is at 7 volts, the scope is looking for the voltage to rise above 7 volts from any point below 7 volts. It has to cross that threshold in an upward direction to satisfy the trigger. Once the screen is full, it will stop drawing. Even if the voltage remains above the trigger point, it doesn't keep drawing. It wants to see it cross the trigger point again. Also know that the scope begins drawing from this point forward. But since it's always recording, even though it may not be drawing on the screen, it will also instantly backfill this area over here. It starts drawing at our trigger point and draws forward, but this part to the left of the trigger is instantly backfilled. So wherever you have the trigger set, you could have it set way over here or way over here. You can see this pretty easily if you have a really slow sweep time. But the sweep time here is so fast you won't notice it. It will all look like it's just appearing all at once anyway. So what would happen if we change the slope but leave trigger alone? If all we do is change it to a down slope? Well, the scope would still be looking for the voltage to cross the 7 volt line, but instead of an upward direction from low to high, it would be looking for the voltage to cross the 7 volt line from high to low. So basically what would happen is this pattern would shift. This part would be over here at our trigger point, and this part would shift. The whole thing would shift to the right. Now we can see the pattern is playing. I changed the slope to a down slope here, and the whole thing shifts. If we turn the trigger off, we go back to what we had before, where it's bouncing around so much we can't see it. So we change back to an upslope, and back to a downslope. So now I have the Pico in demo mode, and we have a demo fuel injector just flashing by again so fast we can't make heads or tails of it. Setting trigger on a Pico is done down here at the bottom by default. So a repeat trigger is generally what you want to set. And the difference between repeat and single is if you set it to a single trigger, it will only draw once. No matter how many times it crosses the trigger threshold, it will only draw one pattern and then it will stop. Repeat, it will function just like the snap-on. It will keep drawing every time it crosses that threshold. And in auto, even if the signal's not crossing the threshold, it will continue to draw, just not at the same fast rate. It's basically, auto can sometimes help you find where you want to put the trigger. But generally, I just use it on repeat if I use a trigger at all. So this little yellow dot's our trigger. So if we move it up to this point, and here is our slope. We're on a rising slope. So every time the voltage goes from low to high, it draws on the screen. Let's put a little less time on the screen. Now, remember what happens if we just, all we do is change the slope, it's going to be looking for the voltage to fall. So it's going to shift this to this point. And I didn't show you this on the snap-on, but you can move the trigger point horizontally as well as vertically. So we can put the trigger point way over here on the left side. Or we can put it way on the right. Some live scopes or even some DSOs have a trigger point that is set to a certain horizontal position, so you can only change it vertically. Now I'm going to show you if we just set single. See, it only draws once, and then we have to hit play again. It'll only draw one time. Back to repeat. And then we can turn trigger off. Because remember what I said, most of the time Pico users just put a lot of time on the screen. And then pause. And go in and look at whatever they want to see from there. But do practice using this. I promised I would show you how to get around the Pico Gap. First, I want to display that gap a little better than I did in the previous video. The more samples you have on the screen, the more pronounced the gap is. I don't know if you noticed, but that took a good 1 or 2 seconds from the time the waveform reached the right end of the screen until it began drawing the next waveform. So if a failure happened, we'll watch it happen one more time. If a failure happened now, you would miss it. So to get around the Pico Gap, the little gap from happening at the end of each waveform, what you want to do is set a repeat trigger. Make certain the voltage scale is set somewhere where you will not reach that voltage. You want to make sure that not even a spike will reach that high. Now take your trigger and put it all the way on the top right of the screen. Now what will happen is the scope continues to look for the trigger point, but the trigger point is never reached. Since it's never reached, the waveform will begin scrolling. Now the only downside is you have to be close to the scope. If something happens, you have to pause it, because if you'll notice, we're not counting up waveforms. We're not saving multiple waveforms anymore. So if the fault occurred, say here, you can follow it. And once it gets all the way over here and goes off the edge of the screen, you've lost it. So we're back to functioning similar to the way the snap-on scope functions, in that you don't have a lot of time if a fault happens, but you won't miss it. It won't fall into the Pico Gap. Now, generally, this is not something I have to do very often. I only do it if it's an extremely rare failure and I want to make certain I absolutely do not miss it when it finally happens. The last thing I want to do is have a problem that takes 30 minutes to reproduce to fall in that little gap and not see what happens. The other thing I will do when I am doing this is I will typically have a pretty high sample rate. Maybe not as high as I just had it right then, but I may set it up to 8 or 10 or maybe even 20 megasample, because I want to make absolute certain that I don't miss anything if it is a very intermittent failure. Well, that brings this episode to a close. By now, you should be able to get a usable waveform on the screen no matter which type of automotive scope you have. Don't forget to check out the video on tips and warnings for new scope users. I'll put a link to that one in the description below. If you've enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to help support this channel, you can do so through Patreon. I'll also have a link to that in the description below. Keep an eye out for the next Automotive Oscilloscope video, where we will learn more functions and I will start to include some simple case studies. Thank you everyone, and have a great day.